Hi everybody, this is Crista Cowan. I have a little bit of a cold today, so I hope you'll bear with me. Today we're going to be talking about death records. I guess that's appropriate considering it's a week before Halloween. I've got a few things that I can show you in the next 20 minutes or so. The first thing is going to be where you can find the death records that we have online at Ancestry.com. The second thing will be to just walk you through a few of those databases, and then finally we'll answer that question that I got, which is what exactly can a death record tell me? Hopefully this will give you enough information to get started digging into some death records on your own. So here we go. The first thing, and you'll hear me say this over and over and over again, is where do I find the records that I'm looking for? The card catalog is one of my most favorite, but I think your most underused resources. You can find it by hovering over your search button, scrolling down to the card catalog and clicking on that. What you'll discover quickly when you get into that card catalog is that Ancestry.com has over 30,000 databases. To find the death records, just click on this little birth, marriage, and death link over here. You'll notice it drops down to 3,100 databases. Then click on death just to get the death records that we have available. That gives you about 1,800 databases to look through, which still seems a little much. We're going to look today at just U.S. records, and you may notice I have this particular list sorted by popularity. I did that because the databases I want to show you today are our most used databases. There's some underused resources here that maybe we'll get into another time. So when you're talking about death records, there's a lot of different sources that'll give you information about death. One of the most popular is our Social Security Death Index. That covers people in the United States who had a Social Security card and whose deaths were reported to the Social Security Administration. Now when I look up, for example, my great-grandfather, Victor Mulliner, you'll discover here that I learn his Social Security number, his last residence, which was in Trail, Oregon, his birth date, and in this case the month and year of his death. I also learned that his Social Security card was issued in the state of California before 1951. Now, one of the reasons this may be a little interesting is I happen to remember my great-grandfather. He died after I was born. I was probably about 3 or 4 when he died. But as far as I knew, he always lived in California. They moved there when my grandmother was a small child. And so this gives me a piece of information that could lead to some conversations. I could ask my grandmother why he was living in Trail, what was up there, why that's where he died. I also have the opportunity here to request a copy of his original Social Security application. When they filled that out, they listed their birth date and place, and also their parents' names in many occasions. And so that could provide me with some additional information there. Now, the mother lode of death records, of course, is going to be an actual death certificate. Now, not all states in the United States provided death certificates much earlier than the early 1900s. And even those that have kept death certificates, not all of them have made those death certificates publicly available or accessible. In a lot of states, there's laws that prohibit that. But where we can access them, we do. You'll notice this is the North Carolina death certificates from 1909 through 1975. 1909, I believe, is when the state started aggregating the death certificates in North Carolina, and 1975 is how recently they've made them publicly available. Now, one of the things I want to point out, whenever you get to a search screen to look at a set of records, I would recommend scrolling down past that search box to the source information, where you'll learn exactly where Ancestry.com obtained those records. In this case, it's the North Carolina State Board of Health and Bureau of Vital Statistics. And also, you'll learn a little bit of information about what's going to be included on that death certificate, just to give you an idea before you get started about what you're going to get into. Now, we're going to search this North Carolina death certificates database for a cousin of mine. I've been trying to verify some information about him and his family. All I'm going to plug in is his name, and the fact that I'm pretty sure that he died in Henderson County, North Carolina. And then click search. We see that Thomas Jefferson Shipman comes up here first in the search results. If I click on that, it'll take me to an index page that lists the information we've indexed off that record. But more important than that, it has an original image. So I'm going to click through to that original image and see what additional information I can find out about Mr. Thomas Jefferson Shipman. So here we see a copy of the death certificate. Again, the place of death here is Henderson County, which corroborates the information that I knew about him. The city is Hendersonville. His full name is listed, Thomas Jefferson Shipman, and his residence, which is kind of fun, of 7th Avenue East. Now, if I scroll down just a little bit, you'll find a whole treasure trove of additional information on this certificate. This question right here says, if married, widowed, or divorced, and then it asks for the name of the husband or wife. In this case, not only is the wife listed, Anna Hazeltine Allen, but Allen is her maiden name, and so now I have that information. You won't always find that on a death certificate. Sometimes it would list Anna Hazeltine Shipman. It would list the married name because that's all the informant knew. But in this case, I have that maiden name now, and that's fantastic. It also lists my date of birth for Thomas Jefferson Shipman, which is November 29th, 1840. He was 94 years of age and 3 days when he died, so he died 3 days after his 94th birthday. His occupation is listed here as a retired farmer. Now, occupation may not seem that important to some of you, but one of the reasons why that becomes a critical piece of information, particularly with this North Carolina family of mine, is that a lot of these cousins tended to name their children the same thing. So I could have 3 or 4 or 5 Thomas Shipmans living in the same vicinity in the same time period. And when I start attaching things like occupation, it helps me to be able to differentiate between the 3 or 4 different men with the same name. Sometimes even the spouse's name doesn't help, as a couple of these men both married women named Mary Simpson. If you look a little bit further down on this death certificate here, you'll also find that Thomas's birthplace is recorded as Henderson County, North Carolina. Now you'll notice that the city or town field is blank. Oftentimes, people were born outside of incorporated city limits, and so a county is as close to a geographic designation as you're going to get. That certainly is the case with this family. It's a very rural area. As a matter of fact, I was just in Henderson County in May doing some research. It's very, very rural. And so if the people were born and lived and died outside of incorporated cities, you're not going to be able to fill in a town because there wasn't one. So in this case, Henderson County, North Carolina is in fact his actual birthplace. Now, here comes some really good genealogy gold. Just below the birthplace, it lists his parents' names. You'll see here that his father's name is Jacob Shipman, and Jacob was born in South Carolina. Nothing further there, you'll notice, no county or town. That's probably because the informant didn't know more details about that. Now that may seem a little bit unusual to some of you, but the informant on a death record could be, usually it was a close relative, but it could be, a daughter-in-law, or it could be the wife who never knew her in-laws. Lots of different scenarios there, and so you have to keep that in mind when you're looking at this information. Now, it does look like the informant has some idea of Thomas's mother's name. Her name recorded here is Esther Byers. Again, we've got a maiden name listed, and that's fantastic. Now, a word of caution. Again, that informant might not always know the whole story. So use this information, but make sure that you understand that it's just another piece of information and that you should be collecting as much information as possible. I've seen cases where the mother's maiden name was entirely wrong. I've seen cases where the mother's whole name was entirely wrong. In one case, the child had been raised knowing their grandmother, What they didn't know was that that grandmother that they knew was actually not the mother of their father. Their father's mother had died when he was young, and his father had remarried, and so he had been raised by this woman, but she was not actually his birth mother. All the children just assumed that she was. So when the father died and it came time to inform on the death certificate, they gave the name of the stepmother because that was what they knew. Later, through records, we were able to prove otherwise. But use this as good clues, and certainly you have every reason to get excited when you see this level of detail and information on a death certificate. Now, according to the informant here, Esther Byers was born in Buncombe County, North Carolina. And then just below that here, we see that the informant on this death certificate was Carl Shipman of Hendersonville, North Carolina. Now, I know that Carl Shipman happens to be Thomas Jefferson Shipman's son, and so that gives me some great information. Now, let's scroll up in this other column here on this certificate. There's also usually going to be a section that has medical information. For those of you who participate in family history, in order to provide a medical history for your family, which is a great thing to do, this will provide you with the information that you need about what illnesses that they suffered from or what the cause of death was, so that you can record that and track any patterns in your family. You'll notice here that it lists the date of death as December 2nd, 1934. The doctor certified that he was treating the deceased from November 26th through December 2nd. So he was sick for about a week, it looks like, before he passed away. The cause of death is listed here, which in this case is bronchopneumonia. Now, there will be some circumstances where it'll list a primary cause of death or a principal cause of death, and then just below that, it will list contributory causes. So, for example, I have a death certificate in my possession that lists that the cause of death was heart failure and renal failure, but the contributory cause is listed as diabetes, which is a piece of information that I'm going to want for my records if I know so that I can know that that runs in my family. Scrolling down just a little bit, you can learn here some final information over here on the left-hand side. It lists here where burial will take place, which in this case is in Ebenezer. That's not a whole lot of information, but a Google search for Ebenezer and Henderson County, North Carolina quickly tells me that Ebenezer is actually the name of a cemetery, that burial was on December 4th, 1934, and that funeral arrangements, the undertaker here was the Thomas Shepherd's Funeral Home in Hendersonville. Now, the reason why that's important, the same informant didn't always provide the information for both the coroner and the funeral home and the cemetery sexton. And so you could get documents from each of those three places and find some either corroborating evidence or some slightly differing evidence that will help you get a little bit closer to the truth as far as your ancestors' death records go. So that is just one example of a death certificate from 1934 and the fabulous information that you can find on it. As I mentioned, however, not every state provides that level of detail when it comes to access to some of these death certificates. One of the most popular and one of my favorite databases is actually the California Death Index. A lot of my family is from California. Many of them still live there. And you'll notice that this death index covers from 1940 to 1997. Now note, it's just an index, which means the actual certificates are not going to be attached. But that does not make this any less valuable. So I'm going to look here for my great-grandmother. As a matter of fact, this is my great-great-grandmother, who is the mother of Victor Mulliner that we looked at a few minutes ago. Here she is, Sarah Amanda Mulliner. Her name is actually Amanda, Sarah Amanda Mulliner. This will tell me that she was born on the 28th of July, 1863 in the state of Utah. She died on the 12th of April, 1955. And because this is a California death index, this death place field is actually the county. So it doesn't necessarily mean that she died in the city of Los Angeles. In this case, it's the county. Then, and I love this, this index record also lists her father's surname, which would be her maiden name, and her mother's maiden name. So it provides me with some additional information, even though it's just an index. Now, if I wanted to order an original certificate, I can come over here to this little link, order original certificate, and do just that. And possibly get information about her burial, where she was buried, information about who she was married to if I didn't already know that. I could see who the informant was on her death certificate. Now, who the informant was might not seem like a big deal, but sometimes that informant is a married daughter. And if you didn't know who the daughter married, now you have the daughter's married last name. So I always pay close attention to that informant, not just so that I know what their relationship was, so that I know to what degree to trust the information, but also because of those daughters who get married and change their names. So this California Death Index is a great source to do that. And a lot of states provide this level of information. Again, if you go back into that card catalog, you can filter down by state to see if we have indexes or certificates for records that you're interested in. Now, the final database that I just want to share with you today is what we call our historical newspapers announcements. It covers 1851 through 2003. And you'll notice again, if you scroll down past that search box, you have a whole list of which newspapers are contained in this database and the years that they cover. Now again, in my case, my family has been in Los Angeles for a really long time, and so there's some information there that I might be interested in. If you scroll down, you'll find some additional information about what kinds of records, how and when newspapers came out, how often they came out, if they came out weekly or daily, if the name of the newspaper changed over time. All of that kind of information is going to be there in that database description. Now, I'm going to search again for that same grandmother. Now that I know that she died in 1955 and that she died in Los Angeles, I can narrow my search down here in this database to just Sarah Moliners, who had a death in 1955 and were living in Los Angeles County. When I click search, you'll see that the very first entry that comes up is a Los Angeles Times obituary from the 15th of April, 1955. That's the right time period. When I click on that, I'll get an image of an actual clip of that newspaper page. And if I scroll down, there she is, Mrs. Sarah Moliner, age 91, who leaves 117 survivors. As a matter of fact, I think if you scroll down a little bit further in this obituary, you'll discover exactly how that breaks out. She leaves 4 daughters, and now you'll notice it lists the married names of each of her 4 daughters, her 2 sons' names, and then it says 30 grandchildren, 58 great-grandchildren, and 22 great-great-grandchildren. I never knew Grandma Sarah, but I grew up with pictures of her all over my grandmother's home, and I've heard lots of stories. This just provides me with some additional information about where she lived, where she was buried, how many people survived her upon her death, and the names of those married daughters. And if you spend any time with me at all, you'll quickly learn that I don't just like to do that ancestry research. I like to do that descendancy research. Make sure all 117 of those survivors, as of 1955, are accounted for in our family history. So that's just a little bit of information about what you're going to find in a death record. Let me just provide you with a few final reminders about what we talked about. The informant on any death record was usually a close relative. The informant didn't always have accurate or complete knowledge of those dates and places and maiden names, so make sure that you collect as much information as possible to corroborate that information. And also be aware that the same informant didn't always supply information to the coroner and the funeral director and the cemetery sexton and the newspaper. So if you can get your hands on any one of those pieces of information, that's great. But if you can get your hands on more than one of those pieces of information, that's even better. Collect as much information as you can. That's all I have for you today. If you have another question for me, we'll be doing this every week or so. You can email me at ask@ancestry.com, and you just might be featured in our next episode. Next week, I hope you'll join us on Monday for a special Halloween episode with Lorraine Bourne. She'll be on at 1 o'clock Eastern, giving you 5 tips for online grave digging. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan, and I hope you have fun climbing your family tree, no matter which direction you're going.